Hi, my name is Giza. I'm here on staff at Hope leading our Celebrate Recovery women's ministry, and I'm part of the teaching team, and it is so great to be here with you today. I was wondering, do you have a bucket list? Do you have a list of things that you would like to do or achieve while you are here on this earth? I have a few of those things on my list, and last year I added one to it. I wanted to backpack the John Muir Trail, a 210-mile hiking trail through the high Sierras of California. The trail starts at a trailhead called Happy Isle in Yosemite and ends near Lone Pine, California at the 14,505-foot peak of Mount Whitney, the tallest peak in the continental United States. It crosses over 10 high elevation passes with over 40,000 feet of elevation gain. In April, it was when I began planning to make this bucket list item become a reality this summer. One of the more challenging parts of the trip was going to be that I decided to go by myself. During the months of preparation, I was often asked why I was doing this, and particularly why I was planning on doing this challenging adventure alone. I honestly didn't have a deep-seated answer for this question. It wasn't that I had personal demons I needed to work through, or there weren't big life questions I was trying to find answers for. I really just felt I wanted to take on this challenge. I did wonder if maybe somehow this solo adventure was going to be an unusual spiritual experience, that maybe if or how God might possibly show up in some big or small ways, and how this trip was going to change me. Before I left, we started this teaching series called God Is. And knowing how long I'd be alone and the amount of silence I would experience out there in the wilderness, I wondered if I might discover something new about God in the silence. As I was preparing for this solo journey, I trusted that God would, as Rick talked about last week in his message, that God would close doors, or the one door, that God would make it clear to me before I'd leave if I wasn't supposed to go, or at least if I wasn't supposed to go alone. There were definitely challenges prior to my departure, challenges that initially looked like they could be closing the door, or one of the doors. I twisted my ankle 2 weeks before. And then there were 2 big wildfires in the Yosemite area. But each one of these resolved themselves like right before. The doors stayed open. So I kept planning and preparing until my departure day came, July 27th. My husband, Gerald, drove me to Yosemite Valley that morning when I needed to pick up my hiking permit. And then to my surprise, my son Aaron showed up with the last-minute overnight permit, so he was actually able to join me on my first day and my first night of hiking. But I'm telling you, when I watched him walk away on that second day, it really hit me hard that now I was really going to be alone and an unfamiliar silence settled in around me. Even reception on my phone began to fade as I kept moving farther and farther into the wilderness. I don't know about you, but on a day-to-day basis, I never turn off my phone. I just put it on silent mode so I don't hear any notifications. When I put it in that mode, it doesn't beep or buzz or ding or vibrate, while it still, though, continues to do what it always does. Receive texts, phone calls, emails, keeping the time, maintaining my calendar, and updating my social media feed. That's what it felt like heading into the silence. Life was still going on around me as it always did, but for my journey, for me, in that moment, silence was settling in, and none of my typical daily noise seemed to matter in that moment anymore. It was somewhat uncomfortable for a while because all I could hear was my own breathing and the noise of my hiking poles hitting the ground as they helped to propel me forward with every step. And then when I would stop, I could hear the noise of the forest, a breeze of wind moving through the tree, or maybe a little branch breaking under the weight of a squirrel running by, or a bird as it tried to get out of my path. It was a very strange and a very unfamiliar feeling as I felt truly alone in the wilderness. And I began to ask myself where and how would I experience God's presence in the middle of this silence? Would I be able to embrace it? Would I be able to embrace this silence? Or would I want to choose to drown it out with music or a podcast or audible books that I actually purposefully had downloaded on my phone, knowing that I would be spending a lot of this time in silence in the wilderness alone? I really believe that silence is often hard for us to deal with. It's not particularly something we actually consider a gift. We may say we crave silence when life is busy and loud around us, but that doesn't particularly mean that once we achieve it, once we have it, that we actually know what to do with it. Even in the silence, we may still hear noise as our busy minds turn our thoughts over and over. And when we want to connect with God, how much of that time is spent thinking our own thoughts and communicating them with God rather than stopping all of that and just sitting with no thoughts and allowing God to speak to us in that moment of silence? You might remember that a couple weeks ago, Gerald actually in his message explored the story of Job. And in that, he talked about the 3 friends of Job who showed up with their God-in-a-box advice. But before they offered their advice, here's what they did. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Now don't miss the significance of that. They sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word. Not saying something, not using our time to comfort someone or make a difference somehow or learn something from it, or just doing anything seems so hard for us to do. Silence is not only uncomfortable to us often, but we tend to interpret it as a loss of time or maybe even a failure. On my first solo day in the wilderness, I was trying to figure out how to manage, what to do with the hours of silence I was going to have available to myself. Interestingly enough, I figured out pretty quickly that unless I felt overwhelmed by the silence, I was actually able to embrace it. That silence became a place of peacefulness and comfort. And while beginning to really enjoy the silence, still I was wondering if and how God might show up in all of that. And honestly, I'm not sure what I even expected. I just had this idea that maybe being so connected in nature and being alone so many hours of the day and night, that God would be speaking to me in a louder voice as I was huffing and puffing up and down the mountains and valleys and sleeping in my tent perched up high on rocks overlooking valleys or by creeks or even lakesides. So I'm wondering, how about you? Does God talk to you? Or how does God talk to you? Do you hear God's voice? Or does God speak to you through other people or maybe nature or miracles? Or does he talk to you in the silence? It really doesn't matter in that if we're in a good place with God, or if we're looking for approval or support, or if we're feeling distant or just need to experience his presence. No matter what the reason or the situation, figuring out how to connect with God and feel God's existence and presence in our lives is an important part of our relationship with God. I mean, think about it. If we're in a relationship with someone but never feel them being there for us in person or over the phone or even by text or by mail or any type of way, when we need them or just in everyday life, we would eventually lose hope in that relationship. And that can happen in our relationship with God as well. So we need to be open to different ways to hear from and experience God, ways that might seem unusual and unexpected. And that is exactly the situation the ancient prophet Elijah found himself in. He is just coming of a big high. He had defeated 450 prophets of Baal, a pagan god. He had performed several great miracles and even brought someone back from death. But now he finds himself fleeing as his enemies who are looking for revenge are chasing him. And his biggest desire in that moment is to be in the presence of God. And here's what happens. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah was looking for God in the wrong places. Elijah expected God to appear in a loud and powerful way, in a storm or in an earthquake, or even in a fire. But God came in a gentle whisper. The only way Elijah was able to hear God was in the silence, because often that's exactly what we'll discover, that God is in the silence. As I continued on my hike, I experienced a lot of rain and hail and thunder and lightning. It was crazy at times. On the last day, to officially finish the John Muir Trail, my goal was to hike to the summit of Mount Whitney. I had met some other hikers along the way that were camped in the same location, and they all had the same goal the next day, the next morning. So we all planned to get up at midnight, pack up, and start hiking at 2 a.m. so we could actually reach the summit by sunrise. This meant we were going to hike in the dark with headlamps guiding us along that really steep 3,000-foot elevation trail. I knew I wasn't going to be fast enough to keep up with my fellow campers, so after a little while, I was hiking alone up the dark trail when I heard rock loosening and beginning to slide down the mountain across the valley. That was the first of 3 rock avalanches that left me frightened and questioning why I was on this mountain in the dark, alone, with no idea what the trail ahead would look like. I slowed down even more as I became more cautious as I advanced slowly, step by step. In that moment, I doubted I would go all the way to the summit. That's when I saw 2 headlamps approaching from behind, and I stepped aside to allow them to pass. They moved on ahead, but then I saw them stop and allow me to catch up. Without knowing me at all or how I was feeling, what I was going through emotionally, they asked me if it would help me if they would slow down and let me hike with them. I was so surprised by their offer, and without hesitation, I accepted it. I wanted to summit Whitney, but I had also asked God for wisdom and a clear sign if this was the right decision for me physically and from a safety standpoint. And God did answer. But God didn't answer in the loud voice of an avalanche or a storm or a fire. But God answered in the quiet whisper of 2 strangers who saw me struggling and decided to come alongside me and allow me to journey with them to the summit. What I realized in that moment, and as I continued up the mountain, was that God's presence was with me the whole time on this trip. But God didn't show up in loud, dramatic ways, but was in the silent moments of my physical and emotional struggles. When I needed to find a safe campsite at the end of the day, when I was running low on food, when I needed a person to come alongside me to encourage me to keep going. But I needed to be silent long enough to hear and to see and to experience God's voice that so often is present in the silence. Are you listening for God's quiet whisper in the silence? Or are you allowing the emotional or physical intensities of your life, the storms or the earthquakes or the fires or avalanches that are happening in or around you, to distract you so much that it drowns out God's voice asking, what are you doing here? What do you need? How can I be there for you? Can you be silent long enough to experience the presence of God, that you can listen for the voice of God? So I want to encourage you this week that to each day, pick a time, no matter how long, without your phone or a book or music or your people or even the Bible, and just sit in silence and wait and listen for God's voice to meet you there in the middle of your silence. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this reminder that your presence is there and available to us if we just figure out how to access it. And sometimes, God, that is through silence. So help us to find these moments of silence, even in the busyness and then in the loud noises of this world and our world, that we can hear you and find your presence in that silence. And for all this I pray in your precious name, Jesus. Amen. If you want to partner with us here at Hope and partake in what's going on through your generosity, there are 3 ways you could do that. You can go on our website at hopepd.org and click on the donate button. You can text to give to 84321, or you can mail your offering to our church office at 45900 Portola Avenue in Palm Desert, California 92260. Again, it was so great to be here with you, and I hope you will be joining us again next week.